Picking out a consulting firm or a political consultant can sometimes be its own challenge. Having to identify somebody who you know has the connections that can help your campaign succeed and have the experience isn't always easy. Oftentimes, some of the larger firms will only handle races where they know they're going to win. In fact, one of the biggest Republican consulting firms in America will not handle a race in an area where there's a slight chance a Democrat could win. Then they go on national television and talk about all their wins and how great they are, when honestly, if they had to run a campaign in a 50-50 district, they wouldn't know what to do. And so when you're looking for a consultant, I would first try to identify some of the smaller consulting firms. And I say that from experience. You don't want to be one of 50 races. You don't get the personal attention that you need in that scenario. And there's not really a concern for your campaign directly. What tends to happen is I've had clients come to my firm who are with some of these bigger firms because they would call the larger firm and they wouldn't return their phone call for a week or 2 weeks. You want to have somebody who's actually going to return your phone call, and a good test for that is to just call and ask them random questions while you're trying to decide whether you want to hire them. It can be kind of annoying, but the truth is, once you build that rapport, you're on your way. You're on your way to knowing whether this is someone that you can work with. And in my own experience, if I'm working on a campaign that's on the other side of the country or is far away, oftentimes I've slept on candidates' couches. I've stayed for weeks on dairy farms. I've been in mansions. I've been everywhere where I'll stay with the candidate. So it's also good to have a relationship there with somebody who you can count on, and that you're comfortable sleeping on your couch in October leading up to the election, because they're on site to make sure everything goes well for whatever reason, right? So you want to make sure you have someone that you're comfortable with. The campaign manager, however, this is going to be somebody who is going to be, you're looking for a real alpha type, not too much of a perfectionist. You want somebody with a lot of experience. I wouldn't hire a campaign manager probably that was younger than me to work on a larger race. For smaller races, certainly you've got to give some of these younger guys have to get experience somewhere, and these younger guys are willing to work on the smaller campaigns at that level. But when I'm working on a statewide or even had a national campaign, I would take a good look at that experience and not necessarily their network. Politics is all about networks, but what happens is we're not a meritocracy. It's who you know. And there's been plenty of examples where I've seen people in really good positions who simply lack the competence to be there, and it's caused a lot of problems. I'll give you an example. When I was working, one of the states I was working in, we had I was working directly on a national campaign, and I'd come in after a race, one of the election cycles I spent in Virginia. I ended up out in the Midwest, and we had, I was staying at a congressional candidate's home. She was hosting me for a few days while I got settled out there to help run the southern part of the state. And it was really interesting because the candidate wanted a little bit of help. She was a little uncertain about some of the things that were happening on her campaign and just wanted some feedback as to how campaigns usually look. I think at the time I had 15, 16 years experience in by then, because this was just a couple election cycles ago. And she just asked me some very basic questions that seemed very elementary to me. I give her an answer, I tell her what I think, and really thought everything was going well. And I get a call from someone from the state party, one of the leaders in the state party, who for some reason was always drunk when she called me, but that's another conversation, who calls me and says that I offended the campaign manager for this congressional campaign because the candidate had asked me for advice and I had given it, and he didn't like that. And this was a 23, 24-year-old kid who really shouldn't have been in that position. And because of some of the problems of his inexperience, the NRCC actually had to intervene to help win a race that would have been won had he been doing his job correctly. Mail was late, some things weren't put out on time. He just didn't have the mental capacity to handle the job, and it costs the Republican Party and their donors a lot of money when you have people who just shouldn't be there to begin with. If they haven't given the candidate the 30,000 foot view enough that they have to go asking other people what's going on, that's a problem. The lack of confidence that the candidate had in them was also a problem, and the fact that they didn't show enough leadership to identify that there was a problem, I think shows that maybe this person shouldn't be in Congress. Another thing I try to look for in bringing on a campaign manager is making sure we have somebody who's really good. They got to be a good leader. If they're not a good leader, they're not going to lead the campaign well. And so you have to have somebody who's a bit more mature, is a bit of a grown-up, because it just saves you time and money to have somebody who knows what they're doing. And that congressional candidate was in trouble. There was a recount. A lot of things happened that would not have happened. And the margins wouldn't have been so thin if some basic things would have just been done properly. Your state field director is also going to be an important hire. Sometimes this is called the political director. I actually don't know why it has that title. It's the state field director is someone who you count on to oversee the field program. They're the ones, most of the staff on the campaign will actually be reporting to this guy, because you could have anywhere from 6 to 15 regional field directors that work under the state field director. And of course, the regional field director could have anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 field directors working underneath them to go out, knock on doors, interact with voters, and so on. So when you bring in the state field director, you have to make sure that there's someone who has good leadership skills and high emotional intelligence. And I highlight this because that's not as important with the campaign manager because they'll in general have good leadership skills. But when you've got a field organizer and they're out in some county in the middle of nowhere and they're crying because someone screamed at them and threatened to kill them, which happens, you've got to have somebody who can get out there and make sure you put them in a good position mentally. Campaigns are hard. Oh my God, I had a situation where we had a volunteer knock on a door for a Republican campaign. They showed up as registered Republicans or we wouldn't have been talking to them. The guy is angry because he hates Trump, doesn't want people handing out literature for him. The guy just kicks our field organizer off the porch. And now he's on the ground. He calls the police. What the guy didn't know was that field organizer was actually the son of the police chief. So that guy had a hard time. But these two field organizers were there. They're getting screamed at. The regional director's got to go in. I had to go down there. We had the police were involved, and it was a big deal, and it can be a very frightening experience. And so you've got to, when you think of a field organizer, they're the ones that are actually going to have to leave the office to go do something with someone on your staff at any point in time. So another example as to why it's important to have really good staff is crazy things happen on campaigns. I've already given another examples, but let me give you one more. I get a call from a regional director a few years ago, and he tells me that 2 of his field organizers had been arrested by the police. I'm like, which field organizers, right? What did they do? Did they, oh God, what happened? And he goes, dude, they were stopped because they were black. And I says, okay, are you sure? What happened? And he says, they were knocking on doors in this community and they called the police. The police show up. They tell the police what they're doing there, and the police decide not to believe them. They're actually wearing a shirt from one of the state legislative candidates we were canvassing for that week to make sure she got through the election. And so the police had taken these 2 young black men, they'd handcuffed them, started to ask them what they were doing in the neighborhood, why they were there, who they thought they were, and accused them of trespassing. And if you know about the law or have any basic understanding of the law, it is not against the law to go out and knock on doors. It's not a crime at all. And we've been sending other canvassers out in the same area off and on throughout the election cycle. This was the first time these particular field organizers were sent there. So after he tells me that these guys are at the police station, he tells me he's on his way to the police department. He's called the sheriff and let them know what was going on, that they worked for us and wanted to know why they were stopped to begin with. And he tried to say that they didn't say who they were or who they worked for, but they would have had flyers in their hands. They would have had the app on their phone. They had t-shirts for the candidate they were knocking on. So if they would have said, we work for the Republican Party, we're knocking on doors, What the hell else would they have been doing? But they were black, so that's how we are treated by the police. He calls so my regional director calls the state rep that we were knocking on doors for, and he says, hey, these guys have been stopped by the police. They're being held at the police station. We're trying to get these guys released. They were just knocking on doors. They hadn't done anything wrong. The police just decided to harass them. And when he showed up at the sheriff's department, they were still in handcuffs, just sitting there, with them having not done anything except knocked on doors. They actually took them to the sheriff's department over this. The state rep refused to do anything. I thought, well, maybe she just misunderstood it, because he was talking really fast and he's really upset. And he's a young guy in his 20s, hadn't really seen a lot of racism in his life, and he was just furious that he was seeing it in his community, because this was a town he lived in. So he was their one phone call they got when they got to the police station. So I called the state representative who we were knocking on doors for. And I say, hey, our black organizers, they've been taken by the police. They were out knocking on doors. They were black. They were in this neighborhood. I didn't think this part of the state was like this, but apparently it is. And she goes, I can't get involved. I was like, what the fuck do you mean you can't get involved? They're knocking on doors. They were only stopped because they were black in a white neighborhood. You need to get your ass over there and do something. And she actually had the nerve to say that she didn't want to get involved with an argument with the police because it just looks bad, and that it didn't really matter whether they stopped them because they were black, because they should have known better. Is basically what she said. She vehemently refused. We exchanged some very, very fierce words at that minute. And after I'd slammed the phone down, I called the state rep from the district next door, told him what happened. He jumped in his car and went straight there. And by the time I had gotten down there, the other state rep had quickly went down there. In fact, I don't know how he got there so fast, but he recognized this and took it seriously. And it just goes to show you that for every white person who just doesn't want to get involved in trying to do something when it's their responsibility about racism, a lot of state reps, a lot of our officials will do something. And so I was kind of disappointed by the situation, but the speed with which this other state rep thought this was wrong and did something, I thought was really inspirational. The value of having had this regional field organizer there with a cooler head who had already gone through some of these motions before I did it to try to alleviate the situation is another reason why it's so important to have good people with a level head working on the campaign. And so it's going to be important to have somebody who has high emotional intelligence, is really good with working with people, and can be prepared for a situation like I just described. Arguably, one of the most important people on the campaign, and this role has changed with social media. When I got started, oh my God, I think the first campaign office I worked in actually had a typewriter, and you would still call up reporters on the telephone, and you would issue a press release, and you would have to send it over or fax it over to them. So it's nice how things have changed, because instead of press releases, we send out tweets now. Press releases can have their place, but Twitter, it's okay for this position if they're a little bit younger. I wouldn't hesitate to hire somebody who's in their late 20s for a position like this, specifically because you need somebody who can talk good, who's got a decent Rolodex in the media environment they're going to be working. That's always helpful, but not necessary, because those contacts can be built on the ground if they're hired early. And on a federal campaign, when you're having to balance the national media with the local media, you're probably going to get somebody with better experience if they're from outside where you're running. Someone who's familiar with the reporters around the Hill knows also how to reach into the local community and work with the local media to make sure your message gets out the way that you hope that it will, but oftentimes don't, because, things happen on campaigns. Hiring a fundraising team is going to be very helpful. Of course, when you first get started, you'll create a finance committee, and that'll be where you get your initial seed money. But the next step is to hire a national fundraiser who knows the players on the East Coast and the left coast so that they can help you raise money. You end up in a situation where a lot of people who live in blue states and blue districts who have given up on trying to win their local races, so they'll give huge amounts of money to Republicans and other places to make sure we get the majority so that they still get the America that they want. This is true for Republicans and Democrats. So having a fundraiser based out of DC that knows the players is going to be great. You also want to have somebody who knows the players in your state. And so having a local fundraiser and a national fundraiser will be fine because they'll know the people in your state, and whereas the others will know the people everywhere else. So I've loved it when I was on a few campaigns and I saw these teams working really well together. But sometimes you have a firm that has their hands in every state, and if that happens, great, then you don't have to deal with two people. I was really impressed with the firm I worked with. There was one out in California, and they were just as networked in DC as they were in this district in California. It was the smooth process, and they raised money from organizations I'd never heard of. I don't do fundraising though, so that's not my thing. I know how it works. I know how to hire them, and then I stop. I can do direct mail fundraising. I know how to do that. You just have to write fundraising letters and do lists and all that, but there's a whole other level to it, way beyond what I've done. And these people are very impressive, and they work hard, and they do really good. So you're going to need to make sure you hire a good team, and they're going to cost. They're going to cost between $4,000 and $6,000 just to get started, honestly, per month, but they bring it all in. Your digital fundraising, though, you gotta watch it. They like to talk about how Trump raised $11 million, for example, on digital media, but he had to spend $1 million a month or something like that to get those numbers. If you're not running a statewide campaign or higher, you probably don't want to make too big of an investment in that over traditional mail. And so watch the slick digital marketing fundraising vendors. They'll try to get all kinds of money out of you, and then you'll get marginal results. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. But if you got a good fundraiser who has a good record and has experience, they'll know your money is going to be raised with handshakes and dinners and direct mail. In conclusion, if I haven't said it enough, you want to bring people on who are a little bit older and have a little bit more experience, and you're going to pay a little bit more for them. My favorite people to hire are military veterans because they have good leadership skills right out of the box most of the time. And I always like having veterans on the campaign, but I also had some other field organizers who had different experience. One ended up, one of them had a crystal business and then had sold tacos and had a taco truck. And I mean, you just have people come from so many different backgrounds on campaigns. But I said, well, what do you know about how good are you with people? And they've got to be good with people. And that's the thing. I also make sure that I ask people what kind of books they like to read. That's a good test question. I don't need a bullshit answer, but I had a guy explain to me the value of Sherlock Holmes philosophically over Poirot, and the discussion showed that he had a bit more emotional intelligence because of how he talked about the characters. And so while you may have a candidate or be on a campaign where the candidate is an extrovert, that's great, that works well. When you're going to put people in positions of leadership where they have to work with the public, you need people with that emotional intelligence who have some sense and who have seen a thing or two in their lives so you don't have problems. But you also need to bring in younger people, because you'll obviously have people who this is their first job, and you've got to have people that they can work with, who's just above them, who can have their backs and be there for them and help guide them professionally so that they can have a positive experience in what is sometimes a dangerous or challenging job. And campaigns are very tense, and not a lot of people have been in foxholes or been shot at, and so the hardest thing they'll do that day is been screamed at by some guy, right? And they don't know how to handle it. And it's like, you gotta be cool. You know, you gotta meditate, you gotta do some yoga, relax. It's not that big of a deal. You gotta be calm. And so you gotta, I mean, it's hard, but you can find these people if you are those people, which is why it's so important that your first couple of hires be those kinds of people, because they will attract more people like that. And that's why I haven't had a lot of problems on campaigns, unless when I get there, they already have staff and they've got bad leadership at the top, and there's a lot of problems like I talked about earlier. So keep that in mind. Good luck.